Welcome back, everyone, and happy October. This week and next week will be a two-parter for a story again in Everything's Eventual. It is The Man in the Black Suit. So today is going to be part one. Next week will be part two, and then the week after that we'll do another story from the book. Excuse me. All right, let's begin. The Man in the Black Suit. I am now a very old man, and this is something which happened to me when I was very young, only 9 years old. It was 1914, the summer after my brother Dan died in the Westfield, and 3 years before America got into World War I. I've never told anyone about what happened at the fork in the stream that day, and I never will. At least, not with my mouth. I've decided to write it down, though. In this book, which I will leave on the table beside my bed, I can't write long. Excuse me. I can't write long because my hands shake so these days. And I have next to no strength, but I don't think it will take long. Later, someone may find what I have written. That seems likely to me, as it is pretty much human nature to look in a book marked diary after its owner has passed along. So yes, my words will probably be read. A better question is whether or not anyone will believe them. Almost certainly not, but that doesn't matter. It's not belief I'm interested in, but freedom. Writing can give that, I've found. For 20 years, I wrote a column called Long Ago and Far Away for the Castle Rock Call, and I know that sometimes it works that way. What you write down sometimes leaves you forever, like old photographs left in the bright sun, fading to nothing but white. I pray for that sort of release. A man in his 90s should be well past the terrors of childhood, but as my infirmities slowly creep up on me, like waves licking closer and closer to some indifferently built castle of sand, that terrible face grows clearer and clearer in my mind's eye. It glows like a dark star in the constellations of my childhood. What I might have done yesterday, who I might have seen here in my room at the nursing home, and what I might have said to them or they to me, those things are gone. But the face of the man in the black suit grows ever clearer, ever closer, and I remember every word he said. I don't want to think of him, but I can't help it. And sometimes at night my old heart beats so hard and so fast, I think it will tear itself right clear of my chest. So I uncap my fountain pen and force my trembling old hand to write this pointless anecdote in the diary of one of my great-grandchildren. I can't remember her name for sure, at least not right now, but I know it starts with an S. Gave it to me last Christmas, and which I have never written in until now. Now I will write in it. I will write the story of how I met the man in the black suit on the bank of Castle Stream one afternoon in the summer of 1914. The town of Motton was a different world in those days, more different than I could ever tell you. That was a world without airplanes droning overhead, a world almost without cars and trucks, a world where the skies were not cut into lanes and slices by overhead power lines. There was not a single paved road in the whole town, and the business district consisted of nothing but Corson's General Store, Thutt's Livery and Hardware, the Methodist Church of Christ Corner, the school, the town hall, and Harry's restaurant half a mile down from there, which my mother called, with unfailing disdain, the liquor house. Give me a second. Okay, let's try this again. Mostly, though, the difference was in how people lived, how apart they were. I'm not sure people born after the middle of the 20th century could quite credit that, although they might say they could, to be polite to old folks like me. There were no phones in western Maine back then, for one thing. The first one wouldn't be installed for another 5 years, and by the time there was one in our house, I was 19 and going to college at the University of Maine in Orono. But that is only the roof of the thing. There was no doctor closer than Casco, and no more than a dozen houses in what you would call town. There were no neighborhoods. I'm not even sure we knew the word, although we had a verb, neighboring, that described church functions and barn dances. And open fields were the exception rather than the rule. Out of town, the houses were farms that stood far apart from each other, and from December until middle March, we mostly hunkered down in the little pockets of stove warmth we called families. We hunkered and listened to the wind in the chimney, and hoped no one would get sick or break a leg or get a head full of bad ideas, like the farmer over in Castle Rock who had chopped off his wife and 3 kids, who had chopped up his wife and kids 3 winters before, and then said in court that the ghost made him do it. In those days, before the Great War, most of Motton was woods and bog, dark, long places full of moose and mosquitoes, snakes and secrets. In those days, there were ghosts everywhere. This thing I'm telling about happened on a Saturday. My father gave me a whole list of chores to do, including some that would have been Dan's, if he'd still been alive. He was my only brother, and he died of being stung by a bee. A year had gone by, and still my mother wouldn't hear that. She said it was something else, had to have been, that no one ever died of being stung by a bee. When Mama Sweet, the oldest lady in the Methodist Ladies' Aid, tried to tell her at the church supper the previous winter, that the same thing had happened to her favorite uncle back in 73, my mother clapped her hands over her ears, got up, and walked out of the church basement. She'd never been back since, and nothing my father could say to her would change her mind. She claimed she was done with church, and that if she ever had to see Helen Robichard again, that was Mama Sweet's real name, she would slap her eyes out. She wouldn't be able to help herself, she said. That day, Dad wanted me to lug wood for the cook stove, weed the beans and the cooks, C-U-K-E-S, cooks, pitch hay out of the loft, get 2 jugs of water to put in the cold pantry, and scrape as much old paint off the cellar bulkhead as I could. Then, he said, I could go fishing, if I didn't mind going by myself. He had to go over and see Bill Eversham about some cows. I said sure, I didn't mind going by myself, and my dad smiled like that. That didn't surprise him so very much. He'd given me a bamboo pole the week before, not because it was my birthday or anything, but just because he liked to give me things. And I was wild to try it in Castle Stream, which was by far the troutiest brook I've ever fished. But don't you go too far in the woods, he told me. Not beyond where it splits. No, sir. Promise me? Yes, sir, I promise. Now promise your mother. We were standing on the back stoop. I had been bound for the spring house with the water jugs when my dad stopped me. Now he turned me around to face my mother, who was standing at the marble counter in a flood of strong morning sunshine falling through the double windows over the sink. There was a curl of hair laying across the side of her forehead and touching her eyebrow. You see how well I remember it all? The bright light turned that little curl to filaments of gold and made me want to run to her and put my arms around her. In that instant, I saw her as a woman, saw her as my father must have seen her. She was wearing a house dress with little red roses over it, I remember, and she was kneading bread. Candy Bill, our little black Scotty dog, was standing alertly beside her feet, looking up, waiting for anything that might drop. My mother was looking at me. "I promise," I said. She smiled, but it was the worried kind of smile she always seemed to make since my father brought Dan back from the west field in his arms. My father had come sobbing and bare-chested. He had taken off his shirt and draped it over Dan's face, which had swelled and turned color. "My boy," he had been crying. "Oh, look at my boy! Jesus, look at my boy!" I remember that as if it had been yesterday. It was the only time I ever heard my dad take the Savior's name in vain. "What do you promise, Gary?" she asked. "Promise not to go no further than where it forks, ma'am." "Any further?" "Any." She gave me a patient look, saying nothing as her hands went on working in the dough, which now had a smooth, silky look. "I promise not to go any further than where it forks, ma'am." "Thank you, Gary," she said. "And try to remember that grammar is for the world as well as for school." "Yes, ma'am." Candy Bill followed me as I did my chores, and sat between my feet as I bolted my lunch, looking up at me with the same attentiveness he had shown my mother while she was kneading her bread. But when I got my new bamboo pole and my old splintery creel and started out of the dooryard, he stopped and only stood in the dust by an old roll of snow fence, watching. I called him, but he wouldn't come. He yapped a time or two, as if telling me to come back, but that was all. "Stay then," I said, trying to sound as if I didn't care. I did, though. At least a little. Candy Bill always went fishing with me. My mother came to the door and looked out at me with her left hand held up to shade her eyes. I can see her that way still, and it's like looking at a photograph of someone who later became unhappy or died suddenly. "You mind your dad now, Gary." "Yes, ma'am, I will." She waved. I waved too. Then I turned my back on her and walked away. The sun beat down on my neck, hard and hot, for the first quarter mile or so, but then I entered the woods, where double shadow fell over the road and it was cool and fir-smelling, and you could hear the wind hissing through the deep, needled groves. I walked with my pole on my shoulder like boys did back then, holding my creel in my other hand like a valise or a salesman's sample case. About 2 miles into the woods along a road, which was really nothing but a double rut with a grassy strip growing up the center hump, I began to hear the hurried, eager gossip of Castle Stream. I thought of trout with bright speckled backs and pure white bellies, and my heart went up in my chest. The stream flowed under a little wooden bridge, and the banks leading down to the water were steep and brushy. I worked my way down carefully, holding on where I could and digging my heels in. I went down out of summer and back into mid-spring, or so it felt. The cool rose gently off the water, and a green smell like moss. When I got to the edge of the water, I only stood there for a little while, breathing deep of that mossy smell and watching the dragonflies circle and the skitterbugs skate. Then, farther down, I saw a trout leap at a butterfly, a good big brookie, maybe 14 inches long, and remembered I hadn't come here just to sightsee. I walked along the bank, following the current, and wet my line for the first time with the bridge still in sight upstream. Something jerked the tip of my pole down a time or two and ate half my worm. but he was too sly for my 9-year-old hands, or maybe just not hungry enough to be careless. So I went on. I stopped at 2 or 3 other places before I got to the place where Castle Stream forks, going southwest into Castle Rock and southeast into Kashwamark Township. And at one of them, I caught the biggest trout I have ever caught in my life, a beauty that measured 19 inches from tip to tail on the little ruler I kept in my creel. That was a monster of a brook trout, even for those days. If I had accepted this as gift enough for one day and gone back, I would not be writing now. And this is going to turn out longer than I thought it would. I see that already. But I didn't. Instead, I saw to my catch right then and there as my father had shown me, cleaning it, placing it on dry grass at the bottom of the creel, then laying damp grass on top of it, and went on. I did not, at age 9, think that catching a 19-inch brook trout was particularly remarkable, although I do remember being amazed that my line had not broken when I, netless as well as artless, had hauled it out and swung it toward me in a clumsy tail-flapping arc. 10 minutes later, I came to the place where the stream split in those days. It is long gone now. There is a settlement of duplex homes where Castle Stream once went its course, and a district grammar school as well, and if there is a stream, it goes in darkness. Dividing around a huge gray rock nearly the size of our outhouse. There was a pleasant flat space here, grassy and soft, overlooking what my dad and I called South Branch. I squatted on my heels, dropped my line into the water, and almost immediately snagged a fine rainbow trout. He wasn't the size of my brookie, only a foot or so, but a good fish just the same. I had it cleaned out before the gills had stopped flexing, stored it in my creel, and dropped my line back into the water. This time, there was no immediate bite, so I leaned back, looked up at the blue stripe of sky I could see along the stream's course. Clouds floated by east to west, and I tried to think what they looked like. I saw a unicorn, then a rooster, then a dog that looked a little like Candy Bill. I was looking for the next one when I dozed off. Or maybe slept. I don't know for sure. All I know is that a tug on my line so strong it almost pulled the bamboo pole out of my hand was what brought me back into the afternoon. I sat up, clutched the pole, and suddenly became aware that something was sitting on the tip of my nose. I crossed my eyes and saw a bee. My heart seemed to fall dead in my chest, and for a horrible second I was sure I was going to wet my pants. The tug on my line came again, stronger this time, but although I maintained my grip on the end of the pole so it wouldn't be pulled into the stream and perhaps carried away, I think I even had the presence of mind to snub the line with my forefinger. I made no effort to pull in my catch. All of my horrified attention was fixed on that fat black and yellow thing that was using my nose as a rest stop. I slowly poked out my lower lip and blew upward. The bee ruffled a little, but kept its place. I blew again, and it ruffled again. But this time, it also seemed to shift impatiently, and I didn't dare blow any more, for fear it would lose its temper completely and give me a shot. It was too close for me to focus on what it was doing, but it was easy to imagine it ramming its stinger into one of my nostrils and shooting its poison up toward my eyes and my brain. A terrible idea came to me, that this was the very bee which had killed my brother. I knew it wasn't true, and not only because honeybees probably didn't live longer than a single year, except maybe for the queens. About them, I was not so sure. It couldn't be true because bees died when they stung, and even at 9 I knew it. Their stingers were barbed, and when they tried to fly away after doing the deed, they tore themselves apart. Still, the idea stayed. This was a special bee, a devil bee, and it had come back to finish the other of Albion and Loretta's 2 boys. And here is something else. I had been stung by bees before, and although the stings had swelled more than is perhaps usual, I can't really say for sure, I had never died of them. That was only for my brother, a terrible trap which had been laid for him in his very making, a trap which I had somehow escaped. But as I crossed my eyes until they hurt in an effort to focus on the bee, logic did not exist. It was the bee that existed, only that. The bee that had killed my brother, killed him so bad that my father had slipped down the straps of his overalls so he could take off his shirt and cover Dan's swelled and gorged face. Even in the depths of his grief, he had done that, because he didn't want his wife to see what had become of her firstborn. Now the bee had returned, and now it would kill me. It would kill me, and I would die in convulsions on the bank, flopping just as a brookie flops after you take the hook out of its mouth. As I sat there trembling on the edge of panic, of simply bolting to my feet and then bolting anywhere, there came a report from behind me. It was as sharp and preemptory as a pistol shot, but I knew it wasn't a pistol shot. It was someone clapping his hands, one single clap. At the moment it came, the bee tumbled off my nose and fell into my lap. It lay there on my pants, with its legs sticking up and its stinger a threatless black thread against the old scuffed brown of the corduroy. It was dead as a doornail. I saw that at once. At the same moment, the pole gave another tug, the hardest yet, and I almost lost it again. I grabbed it with both hands and gave it a big stupid yank that would have made my father clutch his head with both hands if he had been there to see it. A rainbow trout, a good bit larger than the one I had already caught, rose out of the water in a wet, writhing flash, spraying fine drops of water from its filament of tail. It looked like one of those romanticized fishing pictures they used to put on the covers of men's magazines like True and Man's Adventure back in the 40s and 50s. At that moment, hauling in a big one was about the last thing on my mind, however, and when the line snapped and the fish fell back into the stream, I barely noticed. I looked over my shoulder to see who had clapped. A man was standing above me at the edge of the trees. His face was very long and pale. His black hair was combed tight against his skull and parted with rigorous care on the left side of his narrow head. He was very tall. He was wearing a black 3-piece suit, and I knew right away that he was not a human being, because his eyes were the orangey red of flames in a wood stove. I don't just mean the irises, because he had no irises, and no pupils, and certainly no whites. His eyes were completely orange, an orange that shifted and flickered, and it's really too late not to say exactly what I mean, isn't it? He was on fire inside, and his eyes were like the little isinglass portholes you sometimes see in stove doors. My bladder let go, and the scuffed brown and dead bee was lying on whence. My bladder let go, and the scuffed brown the dead bee was lying on went a darker brown. I was hardly aware of what had happened, and I couldn't take my eyes off the man standing on top of the bank and looking down at me. The man who had walked out of 30 miles of trackless western Maine woods in a fine black suit and narrow shoes of gleaming leather. I could see the watch chain looped across his vest, glistening in the summer sunshine. There was not so much as a single pine needle on him, and he was smiling at me. "Why, it's a fisher boy," he cried in a mellow, pleasing voice. "Imagine that. Are we well met, fisher boy?" "Hello, sir," I said. The voice that came out of me did not tremble, but it didn't sound like my voice either. It sounded older, like Dan's voice maybe, or my father's even. And I could think, all I could think was that maybe he would let let me go if I pretended not to see what he was. If I pretended I didn't see where there were flames glowing and dancing where his eyes should have been. I've saved you a nasty sting, perhaps, he said, and then, to my horror, he came down the bank to where I sat with a dead bee in my wet lap and a bamboo fishing pole in my nerveless hands. His slick-soled city shoes should have slipped on the low grassy weeds which dressed the steep bank, but they didn't, nor did they leave tracks behind, I saw, where his feet had touched or seemed to touch. There was not a single broken twig, crushed leaf, or trampled shoe shape. Even before he reached me, I recognized the aroma baking up from the skin under the suit, the smell of burned matches, the smell of sulfur. The man in the black suit was the devil. He had walked out of the deep woods between Mountain and Kashwakamak, and now he was standing here beside me. From the corner of one eye I could see a hand as pale as the hand of a store window dummy. The fingers were hideously long. He hunkered beside me on his hams, his knees popping just as the knees of any normal man might. But when he moved his hands so they dangled between his knees, I saw that each of those long fingers ended in what was not a fingernail, but a long yellow claw. You didn't answer my question, Fisher boy, he said in his mellow voice. It was, now that I think of it, like the voice of one of those radio announcers on the big band shows years later, the ones that would sell Geritol and Cerudin and Ovaltine and Dr. Grabow pipes. Are we well met? Please don't hurt me, I whispered in a voice so low I could barely hear it. I was more afraid than I could ever write down, more afraid than I want to remember, but I do. It never even crossed my mind to hope I was having a dream, although I might have, I suppose, if I had been older. But I wasn't older. I was 9, and I knew the truth when it squatted down on its hunkers beside me. I knew a hawk from a handsaw, as my father would have said. The man who had come out of the woods on that Saturday afternoon in midsummer was the devil, and inside the empty holes of his eyes his brains were burning. "Oh, do I smell something?" he asked, as if he hadn't heard me, although I knew he had. "Do I smell something wet?" He leaned forward toward me, with his nose stuck out like someone who means to smell a flower, and I noticed an awful thing. As the shadow of his head traveled over the bank, the grass beneath it turned yellow and died. He lowered his head toward my pants and sniffed. His glaring eyes half closed, as if he had inhaled some sublime aroma and wanted to concentrate on nothing but that. "Oh, bad!" he cried. "Lovely bad!" And then he chanted, "Opal, diamond, sapphire, jade. I smell Gary's lemonade." Then he threw himself on his back in the little flat place and laughed wildly. It was the sound of a lunatic. I thought about running, but my legs seemed two countries away from my brain. I wasn't crying, though. I had wet my pants like a baby, but I wasn't crying. I was too scared to cry. I suddenly knew that I was going to die, and probably painfully, but the worst of it was that might not be the worst of it. The worst of it might come later, after I was dead. He sat up suddenly, the smell of burnt matches fluffing out from his suit and making me feel all gaggy in my throat. He looked at me solemnly from his narrow white face and burning eyes, but there was a sense of laughter about him, too. There was always that sense of laughter about him. "Sad news, Fisher boy," he said. "I've come with sad news." I could only look at him with the black suit, the fine black shoes, the long white fingers that ended not in nails but in talons. "Your mother is dead." No, I cried. I thought of her making bread, of the curl lying across her forehead and just touching her eyebrow, standing there in the strong morning sunlight, and the terror swept over me again, but not for myself this time. Then I thought of how she'd looked when I set off with my fishing pole, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hand shading her eyes, and how she had looked to me in that moment like a photograph of someone you expected to see again but never did. "No, you lie!" I screamed. He smiled, the sadly patient smile of a man who has often been accused falsely. "I'm afraid not," he said. "It was the same thing that happened to your brother, Gary. It was a bee." "No, that's not true," I said. And now I did begin to cry. "She's old. She's 35. If a bee stung could kill her the way it did Danny, she would have died a long time ago, and you're a lying bastard." I had called the devil a lying bastard. On some level, I was aware of this, but the entire front of my mind was taken up by the enormity of what he'd said. My mother's dead? He might as well have told me that there was a new ocean where the Rockies had been, but I believed him. On some level, I believed him completely. As we always believe, on some level, the worst thing our hearts can imagine. So that's where I'm going to stop for today. And next week we will finish the story. Actually, we might go a couple more pages. What's a better stopping point? No. I think this is good. All right, we'll stop here for today. And next week we will finish the story. And that will wrap up the man in the black suit. So see you guys next week.